over $5 billion of U.S. corn last year, even though it's the world's second largest producer of the crop. The world's top producer is the U.S.
Today, we're diving into a crisis that's reshaping global agriculture, yet barely making headlines. It's the story of how America went from being the world's corn king to watching billions of dollars in exports simply vanish into thin air. Picture this scene at ports across Shanghai, Rotterdam, and Jeddah. Massive shipping containers filled with perfect American corn are sitting abandoned, not because the grain is spoiled or contaminated, but simply because they carry one problematic label: Product of the United States. That stamp, once a mark of agricultural excellence, has quietly become a deal-breaker in international markets. The numbers tell a devastating story. Over $5 billion of U.S. corn exports disappeared last year, even though America remains the world's largest corn producer. But here's what makes this collapse so chilling. There are no dramatic announcements, no angry protests, no official rejections. Instead, buyers are simply ghosting American suppliers. Phone calls go unanswered, contracts expire without renewal, and paperwork mysteriously gets delayed indefinitely. This isn't happening with fanfare. It's happening in silence, making it even more terrifying for American farmers who wake up each day to find their corn has nowhere to go. From Iowa to Nebraska to Illinois, the same story repeats. Missed orders from South Korea, canceled renewals from Egypt, indefinite delays from Vietnam, and complete radio silence from Saudi Arabia. The psychological impact is crushing. These aren't logistical problems that can be fixed with better machinery or improved storage. This is a reputation crisis that's destroying decades of carefully built relationships. American exporters refresh their emails constantly, hoping for purchase orders that never arrive. While back on the farms, families stare at grain that's perfectly good but completely unwanted. What triggered this seismic shift was a seemingly innocent report from the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates Office. Brazil's corn production was quietly revised upward by 4 million tons, reaching a staggering 130 million tons. That single number, buried in a government document, became the spark that ignited a global market revolution. Suddenly, buyers worldwide saw what they'd been searching for: a cheaper, politically safer alternative to American corn. Within weeks, contracts that had flowed to Iowa and Illinois for decades began shifting south to Brazil. There were no dramatic announcements, just a quiet pivot that changed everything. Egypt canceled long-standing orders, South Korea delayed payments, and Vietnam rerouted entire shipments. Brazil's timing was flawless. While American exporters struggled with stalled contracts and political backlash, Brazil was celebrating its second corn harvest of the year. Their supply chains were humming with efficiency, and the world took notice. Major buyers in Asia and the Middle East started placing their bets on Brazil, not because it was dramatically different from American corn, but because it came without the political baggage. The switch happened with disturbing smoothness. Countries didn't make official announcements or hold press conferences. They simply stopped calling American suppliers. Corn shipments from Nebraska and Indiana were quietly replaced with crates from Mato Grosso and Paraná. Unlike the fragmented American system, Brazil had invested heavily in digitizing their logistics, streamlining tracking systems, and guaranteeing compliance with strict international importing standards. The ripple effects hit rural America like a slow-motion earthquake. Farmers who had secured export deals for generations found themselves completely shut out overnight. Ethanol plants reduced productions. End schedules. Grain storage facilities filled up and stayed full long after harvest season. While American producers desperately tried to renegotiate existing deals, Brazil was already locking in new multi-year agreements with their former customers. But Brazil wasn't the only country capitalizing on America's decline. Just across the northern border, Canada began a quiet, methodical takeover of markets the U.S. had dominated for decades. Without flashy advertising campaigns or trade show presentations, Canadian exporters simply stepped into the exact spaces American companies had vacated. One by one, seemingly unshakable contracts began switching hands. Long-term agreements with Mexico that Midwestern growers considered guaranteed were being renewed with Alberta and British Columbia suppliers instead. Shipments to Asia and Europe that had been filled with Iowa corn for generations were now being replaced with grain from Saskatchewan and Manitoba. The buyers hadn't disappeared, they'd just changed addresses. And there's a crucial reason why this transition happened so rapidly. For countries that depend on steady food imports, consistency means everything. Over recent years, U.S. trade relationships had become defined by tariffs, abrupt policy changes, and constant uncertainty. In stark contrast, Canada offered something invaluable: reliability. The Canadian government maintains a low profile in international trade disputes. There are no surprise embargoes or overnight policy reversals. More importantly, Canada invested heavily in clean, traceable, and transparent export systems that give buyers exactly what they want: certainty about what they're purchasing, when they'll receive it, and what paperwork comes with it. Canadian provinces spent years quietly building a superior export infrastructure. Manitoba, for example, upgraded grain terminals to include automated inspection systems and blockchain-based tracking technology. This means a buyer in Japan or Saudi Arabia can verify exactly what variety of seed was planted, when crops were treated with pesticides, and how grain was stored, all from their smartphone. In the United States, this level of traceability remains fragmented across different cooperatives using incompatible systems. International importers grew tired of the guesswork and uncertainty. In a trade climate where buyers demand full transparency and control, Canada delivers exactly that, while America still struggles with outdated, disconnected networks. What makes this shift particularly painful for U.S. exporters is how seamlessly it occurred. It's not that Canadian corn is superior in quality, it's just dramatically easier to work with. Importers don't worry about political backlash, renegotiated tariffs, or policy changes announced via social media. They can lock in 5-year contracts and trust they won't be torn up by geopolitical tensions or trade wars. This is why Canadian exporters systematically captured every opportunity American companies left behind. They're not making noise or bragging about their success. They're simply showing up consistently with clean paperwork, stable pricing, and reliable delivery schedules. The human cost of this agricultural earthquake is most visible in Iowa, where over 20 million acres of corn and soybeans once represented the pride of American farming. For decades, Iowa was synonymous with feeding the world: endless golden fields, massive storage silos, and a state economy built on one unwavering truth: Iowa corn was essential to global food security. But in 2025, that foundation is crumbling. Exports have collapsed by 42%. Contracts that once guaranteed year-round income have vanished without explanation. Farms that stood as symbols of prosperity are now drowning in debt, uncertainty, and an oppressive silence from former customers. Drive through towns like Cedar Rapids or Des Moines and the evidence is everywhere. Grain storage bins are packed to capacity, not with this year's harvest, but with last year's corn still sitting unsold. At cooperative offices, farmers line up not to arrange shipments, but to request storage extensions. Some are refusing to plant this season because there's simply nowhere to put additional grain. These aren't inexperienced farmers making poor business decisions. These are third and fourth generation agricultural families who've done everything correctly and are still getting crushed by forces beyond their control. Near the town of Dora, an elderly farmer stood quietly beside his barn, pointing at rows of white sacks filled with premium corn. His words were simple but heartbreaking. "We just need someone to take it, that's all." His voice carried no bitterness, just exhaustion. Exhaustion from empty promises, from hearing about new trade deals while his phone stays silent, from watching a lifetime of careful work become worthless through no fault of his own. The nearby ethanol processing plant shut down 2 production lines. The local cooperative laid off longtime staff members. The only thing growing faster than the unwanted corn is the number of foreclosure warnings arriving in mailboxes across rural Iowa. Iowa didn't fail because farmers stopped working hard or producing quality crops. It failed because the entire system surrounding it collapsed. Countries that depended on Iowa corn for decades, Japan, Mexico, Egypt, found new suppliers, not because American products changed, but because American politics became too volatile and unpredictable. Trade wars, retaliatory tariffs, and constant policy shifts made conducting business with the United States too risky for international buyers seeking stability. Iowa farmers, through absolutely no fault of their own, stopped representing that stability in global markets. The emotional cost matches the financial devastation. Farm families are mortgaging land that's carried their name for generations. Some are being forced into early retirement they never planned or wanted. Others take on additional jobs just to keep their agricultural operations afloat. This isn't about pride anymore. It's about basic survival. The community support systems that sustained these farmers for decades are shrinking too. Cooperatives, agricultural lenders, and grain processing facilities are all contracting. When corn stops moving through the economy, everything else follows. The rhythm that drove Iowa's agricultural economy for over a century has stalled, and nobody knows how to restart it. This crisis reached a symbolic breaking point at Shanghai port, where 20 shipping containers filled with Nebraska-grown corn sat baking under the sun. Nothing was wrong with the grain itself. It wasn't moldy, infested, or contaminated in any way. It represented the same top-quality product that had built America's agricultural reputation. But the entire shipment was rejected anyway, not because of anything inside those containers, but because of what was stamped on the exterior: product of the United States. The official rejection reason listed on paperwork was deliberately vague, unclear origin. That meaningless excuse was sufficient to send 18,000 tons of clean, premium-grade corn back across the Pacific Ocean. For Nebraska farmers, that moment represented far more than a lost sale. It marked the beginning of something much more sinister and long-lasting. Nebraska has historically been one of America's corn powerhouses, with an extensive network of farms, cooperatives, and transportation hubs that made it a crucial exporter to countries throughout Asia. But the rules changed dramatically. International importers quietly tightened their requirements, demanding advanced documentation showing everything from original seed varieties to complete spraying schedules, even identifying which workers had handled the grain during processing. Nebraska, operating with outdated record-keeping systems, simply couldn't keep pace with these new demands. The state's cooperatives weren't digitally connected. Documentation standards varied dramatically between regions. There was no unified database capable of providing importers with the transparency and traceability they now required as standard practice. When buyers can't verify exactly what they're purchasing, they move on to suppliers who can. Political risk became another invisible anchor dragging Nebraska's exports down. American agricultural exporters are now perceived as fundamentally unpredictable partners. Years of trade wars, shifting tariff policies, and dramatic policy reversals announced without warning have left global buyers genuinely spooked about long-term relationships with U.S. suppliers. Nobody wants to construct a supply chain around partners who might change fundamental rules with a single signature or social media post. Nebraska farmers aren't the ones creating these policies, but they're paying the full price for decisions made in Washington. International buyers are actively choosing alternatives that come with fewer political complications, and Canada tops that list. Canadian agricultural exporters quietly embraced cutting-edge technologies that provide serious competitive advantages. Blockchain tracking is now standard throughout their export process. Every step of corn's journey from field to international port gets logged in real time and remains visible to buyers worldwide. Alberta and Manitoba invested heavily in making their port logistics faster and more transparent than American alternatives. When international buyers purchase from Canada, they receive complete traceability, minimal political risk, and reliable shipping schedules. That's what Nebraska farmers are competing against, and currently, it's not a fair fight. Corn exports from Nebraska dropped nearly 47% this year alone. That statistic doesn't just exist in government reports. It lives in quiet warehouses across Kearney and Hastings, where unsold corn continues piling up and beginning to spoil. Some cooperatives are selling below cost just to free up storage space. Others are turning away farmers entirely. Families are depleting retirement savings, defaulting on equipment loans, and wondering how much longer they can survive. The quarterly phone calls from Asian buyers that sustained these operations for decades have completely stopped. The buyers haven't stopped purchasing corn, they've just stopped purchasing from Nebraska. For families who built their entire lives around those international shipments, this kind of silent replacement cuts deeper than any formal rejection ever could. Illinois faces its own unique version of this agricultural apocalypse. Once the unbeatable middleman of America's grain network, Illinois is being systematically pushed aside despite its perfect geographic positioning. For generations, it served as the crucial bridge between Midwest cornfields and international markets, with unmatched access to the Mississippi River, major railroad networks, and deep-water ports. Illinois kept American agricultural exports moving like precision clockwork, but that era is ending. Warehouses in cities like Cairo are filled beyond capacity with corn nobody is coming to collect. Conveyor belts that operated around the clock for decades now sit motionless. The constant hum of processing fans has fallen silent, and that silence feels as suffocating. The fundamental problem isn't that Illinois stopped producing quality crops. It's that the entire system built around the state's role as a transport and processing hub is being completely bypassed. International buyers aren't waiting for American corn to flow through Illinois ports anymore. They've written entirely new contracts with Canadian suppliers instead. Quebec is rapidly expanding grain terminal capacity to accommodate massive new orders from European buyers. Manitoba is finalizing comprehensive trade agreements with purchasers throughout the Middle East. These aren't temporary market adjustments. They represent permanent shifts in global grain flow patterns that are systematically rerouting commerce away from American middlemen. Corn that moved effortlessly from Illinois cooperatives to international markets for decades is now accumulating in storage facilities long past normal harvest dates. Some grain has been sitting since last year, deteriorating in quality with each passing week. Farmers desperately need storage space for upcoming crops, but with ethanol plants cutting production and export orders evaporating, the backlog continues growing relentlessly. This forces cooperatives to sell premium grain at significant losses just to clear physical space. The economic ripple effects are devastating entire regional economies. Equipment suppliers, trucking companies, even local restaurants that depended on steady agricultural business are all experiencing the slowdown's impact. Illinois was designed and built to move agricultural products efficiently. It wasn't merely a place where corn grew, it was where corn got cleaned, packaged, processed, and shipped worldwide to feed billions of people. That infrastructure still exists and functions perfectly, but the lifeblood that sustained it, consistent international demand, is rapidly fading away. Today's intern. National buyers prioritize partners offering faster paperwork processing, minimal political complications, and cleaner logistics operations. Canada invested heavily in exactly those capabilities. Their ports feature cutting-edge modernization, export systems are completely digitized, and their political reputation remains calm and dependable. That's precisely what global buyers want, and Illinois is discovering that even the world's best infrastructure becomes meaningless when there's no product flowing through it. Packaging suppliers are canceling bulk orders. Corn that shipped out by the thousands of tons is sitting completely still. Illinois isn't completely eliminated from international agriculture, but it's no longer in the spotlight where it dominated for over a century. The state is watching business it once owned slip away, not because it failed operationally, but because competitors proved faster, quieter, and more trustworthy. That's the kind of market disappearance you don't recognize until it's already complete and irreversible. This is the hidden story behind America's agricultural crisis. It's not about crop failures, natural disasters, or obvious economic collapses. It's about trust, reputation, and the quiet way international relationships can dissolve when politics becomes louder than production quality. The world moved on from American corn, and most people don't even realize it happened. But for the farmers watching their life's work sit unsold in storage facilities across the Midwest, the silence speaks louder than any headline ever could. What are your thoughts on this agricultural earthquake that's reshaping global food systems right under our noses? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Exposing Truth for more stories the mainstream media won't tell you.